I took the Route 3 bus to Secaucus because my car needs a new alternator and I don't have the $300 to fix it. That's the kind of detail that matters when you're trying to understand why I didn't just leave. The shift started at 11. I got there at 10:45 because I'm always early to things I don't want to do. Some kind of nervous habit. The parking lot was empty except for a shopping cart someone had abandoned sideways across 2 spaces and a single car parked way out near the edge of the lot. A beige Buick with 1 working taillight. No other cars. No other people. The FedEx office sign buzzed orange and white above the entrance, and I stood there for a second looking at it, holding my backpack straps, telling myself this was fine. It wasn't fine, but I needed it to be. The Rutgers thing is a whole thing I don't want to get into. But the short version is I've got $41,000 in federal loans. For 2.5 years of a communications degree, I didn't finish. I left in my junior year for reasons that felt important at the time and feel a lot less important now. The loan payments started 4 months ago. I've been picking up whatever I can. A few weeks at an Amazon warehouse in Carteret. Some gig delivery stuff. A short stretch at a Walgreens on Route 9 that ended badly. This was the latest thing. Night shift at a copy center in Secaucus. 11 to 7, 4 nights a week. Not glamorous. Not even close. But it paid $14.50 an hour and they didn't ask too many questions on the application, and those 2 things together basically made it non-negotiable. I pushed through the front door and the cold hit me first. It was colder inside than outside, which didn't make sense for late October, but I figured maybe the HVAC was just broken in the other direction. The store smelled like toner and something faintly sweet underneath it, almost like overripe fruit. I didn't think much of it at the time. The layout was standard FedEx office stuff. Long service counter up front, self-serve stations in the middle, big production printers along the back wall. Everything was very bright. The kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look a little sick. There was a rack of shipping supplies near the door and a display of lamination pouches, and a poster on the wall that said, "Your vision, our mission," in a font that was trying too hard. I'd seen 100 stores like this. I figured I knew what I was walking into. I didn't. The manager, Lincoln Kelly, I'd met him once at the interview, wasn't out front yet. There was a binder on the service counter with a sticky note on it that said, "Anderson, read before Lincoln arrives," which I thought was a little odd, but okay. I dropped my backpack behind the counter, clipped on the name tag I'd been mailed the week before, and started flipping through the binder. It was mostly what you'd expect. Opening procedures, paper stock inventory, how to log customer jobs in the system, standard stuff. I skimmed it. Then I walked back toward the production area to get a feel for the equipment because I'd worked a print shop one summer in college. A small place on George Street in New Brunswick, nothing like this. And I figured the wide format printer was probably the most complicated thing I'd be dealing with. It was a big Canon unit, the kind that prints banners and posters mounted on a heavy metal stand with a paper roll underneath. I walked around the side of it to check the ink levels on the display panel. That's when I saw the photo. It was stuck to the drum on the backside of the printer, kind of wedged between the drum housing and the paper guide. High gloss, the kind of print quality you'd get from a professional machine. I thought for a second it was just a test print someone had forgotten to pull, which happens. I peeled it off. It was me. Not current me. Older me, I think, by maybe 5 years, though it's hard to say exactly. The face was the same, but the cheeks were hollower and the eyes looked like they'd stopped expecting things. I was wearing a FedEx office polo, the same wrinkled one I had on right then, and I was holding one of those cheap plastic Employee of the Month plaques, the kind with the gold plastic border and the little engraved plate in the middle. The plaque had a date on it. I had to tilt the photo toward the light to read it. 5 years from now, almost to the month. There was a dark crimson stain spreading across the bottom corner of the photo. It covered most of the lower right quadrant. I don't know what it was. I didn't want to know what it was. I stood there for probably 30 seconds just holding it. The printer hummed beside me. The fluorescent lights buzzed. I turned the photo over and the back was blank. No printing info, no job number, nothing. I put it in my back pocket. I didn't tell anyone because there was no one to tell, and also because saying something out loud felt like it would make it into a thing that could get me fired. I needed this job. That was the whole equation. So I pocketed the photo and walked back to the front counter and pretended I hadn't found it, which is probably not the response a normal person has to finding a photograph of their own future stapled to a printer. But I'm not sure a normal person takes a night shift in Secaucus in the first place. Lincoln came out of the back office about 10 minutes later. He was average height, stocky, with thinning gray-brown hair slicked flat against his head. He wore the standard manager's collared shirt and khaki slacks, and he walked with a stiffness that I first read as a bad back, or maybe just the posture of someone who'd been sitting at a desk for 20 years. He had small, watery eyes that didn't blink much. His handshake was firm and his skin felt slightly wrong, a little too smooth, like the surface of a phone case that's been in a pocket too long. He smelled like vinegar. Not strongly, but it was there. And underneath that, something adhesive, like the back of a packing tape roll left in the sun. I didn't say anything about the smell. That's me. I clock things and keep them to myself. "Anderson?" he said. Not a question, just confirming I existed. "Yeah," I said. "Warren?" He nodded once and reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a brass key on a plain metal ring. He set it on the counter between us. I reached for it and picked it up and immediately noticed it was cold. Not just room temperature cold. Cold like it had been in a freezer. I held it for a second, waiting for it to warm up from my hand the way metal does. It didn't. "That opens the supply closet at the end of the hall," Lincoln said. "You'll need it before 4. I put it in my front pocket. "Okay." He pulled a laminated sheet from the same pocket. I don't know how both things fit in there, but they did, and set it on the counter. It was titled "Night Shift Operational Procedures" in bold at the top. Below that, a numbered list. 5 items. The text was small and I didn't read it right away, just scanned the shape of it. "These aren't suggestions," Lincoln said. He said it in exactly the tone you'd use to tell someone that the parking validation only works if you get the stamp before you leave the building. Flat, procedural, like it was the most boring sentence in the world. "The store requires specific calibrations to remain functional during overnight hours. The rules support that. Deviation affects the store's stability." I looked at him. "The store's stability. Correct." I picked up the laminated sheet and read through it. I'm not going to pretend I understood it. I didn't. Not really. There were 5 rules, and they were specific in a way that didn't connect to anything I knew about running a copy center. I read them twice. I retained the shape of them without understanding the logic behind them, the way you memorize a phone number without knowing whose it is. Lincoln watched me read. He didn't say anything else. When I set the sheet back down, he picked it up and set it on the shelf under the counter, within reach. "Questions?" he said. "Not yet," I said. He nodded and walked back toward the office. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood at the counter alone. The store hummed around me. The cold key sat in my pocket, and the photo sat in the other one, and the laminated rules were on the shelf below my hands, and the shift had barely started. The first hour I mostly just tried to look busy. That's the honest answer. I didn't know where anything was, I didn't know the machine codes, and the laminated rules were sitting under the counter in a way that made me not want to touch them again too soon. So I walked the floor, checked paper trays, straightened a rack of mailing envelopes that didn't need straightening, found a Sharpie on the floor near the self-serve stations and put it in the cup by the register. That kind of thing. Useful enough to justify existing in the space. The store was quiet in a specific way. Not empty building quiet, where you get the hum of the HVAC and your own footsteps, and that's it. This was more like the quiet was a thing the store was doing on purpose. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency I could feel in my back teeth. The wide format printer in the corner ticked every 40 seconds or so, even though nothing was queued to print. I checked the queue twice. Nothing. It just ticked. I kept moving. There was a section near the back wall I hadn't looked at yet. Past the self-serve copiers, past the lamination station, past a shelving unit with about 30 varieties of binder that nobody in Secaucus was buying at 2 in the morning. Back there, against the wall, was the industrial shredder. It was a big one, the kind businesses rent time on to destroy whole boxes of documents. Came up to my chest. Gray housing, black feed slot, a power cord as thick as my thumb running to the wall. It had a paper sign taped to the front, handwritten in blue marker. Broken. I didn't think much about it. Equipment breaks. I made a mental note to ask Lincoln about it in the morning and started to walk past. The shredder turned on. Not loud. That was the thing. It didn't lurch or rattle or do anything dramatic. It just started running, smooth and steady. The grinding mechanism cycling at normal operating speed. The sound of it was exactly what a shredder sounds like when it's eating paper, except there was no paper. I stopped walking. I looked at it. The feed slot was empty. The collection bin at the bottom was empty. It was just running. I figured it was a glitch. Some kind of timer function, or a reset cycle. I reached for the power switch on the side panel.
Don't.
I pulled my hand back fast. The voice came from inside the machine, from the feed slot specifically, or somewhere close to it. It was a man's voice, low and strained, with the particular quality of someone speaking through clenched teeth, not distorted the way you'd expect from a machine, just muffled, like he was in the next room with the door mostly closed. I stood there for a second. "Hello?" I said, which in retrospect is a pretty stupid thing to say to a shredder, but I didn't have a better option.
Don't feed it.
The voice said.
Don't put anything in, it's already full.
Full of what? I said. A pause. The grinding mechanism kept cycling.
Memories. It's full of 1998. There's no more room.
Another pause.
I put too many in. That was my mistake. Don't make the same one.
I want to be clear that I was not okay with this. I was standing very still and my heart was doing something uncomfortable in my chest, and I was not okay with any of it. But I also didn't run, which I think says something about either my nerve or my financial situation. Probably the second one. "Who are you?" I said.
Edwin.
The voice said.
Edwin Espinoza. I worked the night shift here before you.
I didn't know an Edwin Espinoza. I'd never heard the name. Nobody during onboarding had mentioned a previous night worker, which I was now realizing was a gap in the information I'd been given. "What happened to you?" I said. The grinding sound changed pitch for a second, went higher, then settled back.
Don't feed it.
Edwin said again. His voice had gone tighter.
That's the important thing. Whatever you do tonight, don't put anything in the slot. Memories, paper, anything. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It'll feel like the right thing to do. It won't be. Edwin,
I said. But the shredder slowed down and went quiet, and that was it. The broken sign fluttered once from the air movement of the fan cutting off. I stood there for another few seconds. Then I backed away, slowly, the way you back away from a dog you're not sure about. I put about 15 feet between me and the machine, and then I turned around and walked toward the break room because I needed to be somewhere else immediately. The break room was small. One table, 2 chairs, a microwave that had seen better years, a vending machine with a flickering light over the Doritos. There was a corkboard on the wall with a printed sheet that said, Employee of the Month, and nothing else. No photo, no name. Just the header and a blank rectangle where the picture should have been. I didn't look at it for long. I was doing a thing I do when I'm unsettled, which is look for something to hold. Not for any good reason. Just tactile. I needed something solid in my hands that was definitely an object and definitely made sense. I opened the cabinet under the sink, looking for nothing in particular. There was a bottle of industrial ink solvent on the bottom shelf. Cyan label, black text, the kind of thing you use to clean print heads and flush buildup from the ink lines. I'd used it before at a different job. I knew what it was. I knew what it smelled like. Sharp, chemical, a little sweet in a way that wasn't actually sweet. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, and it was just a bottle. A normal, heavy, full bottle of a thing I recognized. I tucked it into my belt. I don't have a great explanation for that. It just felt like the thing to do. I went back out to the floor and kept working. I restocked the tape dispensers. I figured out the code for the lamination machine. I found a broom and swept the area around the self-serve stations, even though it didn't really need it. I did not go near the back wall. At some point I looked up and it was 2 a.m. The front doors opened. The man who came in was wearing a bright yellow raincoat. The hood was up. He was dragging a wooden crate behind him, one hand on a rope looped through a slat, the crate scraping across the tile floor and leaving a wet black trail behind it. The fluid was dark, almost oil dark, and it spread into the grout lines and didn't move the way water moves. I looked outside through the glass doors. The parking lot was dry. The sky was dry. There was no reason for a raincoat. Rule 2 was on the laminated sheet under my hands. I'd read it twice. I remembered the shape of it. I looked at the crate. I looked at the black fluid spreading across my floor. I looked at the hood of the raincoat, which was pulled forward enough that I couldn't see anything inside it from this angle. I knew what the rules said. I looked anyway. I came around the counter and I walked toward him, and I looked directly into the hood, and there was no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, domed surface, pale and taut, with purple veins running through it in branching lines. They pulsed, slow and rhythmic, in perfect time with the buzz of the fluorescent lights above us. I watched 2 pulses happen before I stepped back. The figure moved to the counter, set something down on it. A sheet of paper folded once. Then one arm came up and pointed, slow and deliberate, toward the far end of the store. There was a sign there I hadn't noticed before, or maybe it hadn't been there before. White background, black text. The basement of the Atlantic. I looked at the sign. I looked back. The figure was gone. The front doors hadn't moved. It was just gone. The crate was still there, leaking black fluid onto the tile in a slow spreading pool. The folded paper was on the counter. The basement of the Atlantic sign was still up at the far end of the store, lit from below by the same fluorescence that had been pulsing in time with whatever I'd just looked into. I stood at the counter and didn't touch the paper yet. The ink solvent pressed cold against my hip through my shirt. I picked up the paper, unfolded it once. It was heavier than regular copy paper, slightly waxy, the kind of stock we used for high-gloss flyers. Whatever was on it had been drawn by hand, not printed. Dark ink, pressed hard enough that the lines had a little ridge to them when I ran my thumb across. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. Floor plan. Small house, 2 stories, hand-drawn in that careful way where whoever did it was trying to be accurate, not artistic. Front door centered on the bottom, stairs running up the left side. The bathroom at the top with the weird offset door that never fully cleared the sink. The kitchen addition on the back right corner that my dad built in 1999 and never quite leveled right. Every window had a jagged red X through it. Every single one. I knew that house. I grew up in that house. The address was 917 Greenwood Avenue, Trenton, and I hadn't lived there since I was 18, but I knew every room on that page. The little rectangle in the upper left was my old bedroom. The rectangle next to it was the linen closet my mom kept locked because the handle was broken and she never got around to fixing it. The back room that we called the sunroom, even though it only got sun for about 40 minutes in the afternoon. All of it. Exact. I stood at the counter for a while just holding it. The black fluid from the crate was still spreading across the tile behind me. I could hear it moving. This slow, wet sound, like it was feeling around for somewhere to go. I set the paper down flat on the counter and looked at it again like maybe I'd misread it. I hadn't. Every window read X. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't want to think too hard about it. I went for the phone. The store had a landline on the counter, one of those flat gray office phones with a row of line buttons down the side. I picked up the receiver and dialed 911. Pressed each button deliberate, made sure I wasn't hitting anything wrong. The line was dead. Not a busy signal, not a recording, just nothing. This flat, empty silence that felt wider than a dead line should. I stood there with the receiver against my ear for a few seconds, and then the silence changed. Something came through it. A voice. Distant at first, like it was coming from the far end of a very long hallway, but getting clearer fast. A woman's voice. I knew it before I could even make out the words. I knew it the way you know your own name when someone says it. Automatic. No processing required. My mom. She was screaming my name. Warren. Except it wasn't coming out forward. It was reversed, the syllables flipped and running backwards, so it came out as this wrong, wet sound that my brain kept trying to decode and couldn't quite get there. But I knew it was her. I knew her voice. I'd known her voice my whole life. And whatever the store or the line or whatever was doing to it, the source was her. I stood there and listened to it for probably 4 seconds. That's a long time to listen to something like that. Then I set the receiver down. Carefully. Didn't drop it. Didn't slam it. Just placed it back in the cradle with both hands and made sure it seated right. Dropping it felt like it would mean something. Like it would be an acknowledgement. I wasn't ready to acknowledge anything yet. I stepped back from the phone and put my hands flat on the counter and looked at the map of my childhood home with all the X'd windows. And I kept my breathing even, and I didn't think about what I just heard. I filed it somewhere I could get to later, or never, whichever turned out to be available. The break room door opened. Lincoln came out. I'd seen Lincoln walk before. During orientation, he'd moved fine, normal, nothing weird about it. This was not that. He was moving like someone was operating him from a slight delay. Each step landing a beat after it should. His arms not swinging quite right, his head tracking a half-second behind his body when he turned. Like a video file with the audio out of sync, except it was a person. Except it was whatever Lincoln was. He stopped on the other side of the counter and looked at me with those small, watery eyes, and he didn't say anything right away. I didn't say anything either. The fluorescence buzzed. The black fluid crept across the tile behind me. Then Lincoln reached up with both hands and started peeling. I don't know how else to describe it. He grabbed the skin at his collar, right below the jaw, and pulled it away from whatever was underneath, and it came off like bubble wrap. That same sound, almost. A series of small, soft pops. He worked methodically, pulling it back in sections, folding it away, and he didn't react to it at all. No pain, no expression, just procedure. Underneath there was no flesh, no muscle, no bone, no blood. There were keys, old ones, the kind with the round bow at the top, tangled up with USB cables and phone chargers from 3 or 4 generations ago. The chunky white iPhone bricks, the old micro USB ones, a couple of the round 2-prong adapters nobody's used since the early 2000s. Packing tape wound through all of it in dense loops, holding the mass together, binding the keys to the cables to the other keys. It shifted when he moved. I could hear it, this faint rattling and rustling, like a junk drawer that had learned to walk. I didn't move. I wasn't sure my legs were available. "You've broken Rule 2, Lincoln said, same flat tone, like he was telling me the copier was low on paper. "I know," I said. "That changes the timeline." He folded the last section of skin back and set it on the counter between us like he was setting down a folder. "I want to be clear about what this place is so you understand what the timeline means." I looked at the folded skin on the counter, then back at him, at whatever Lincoln was. "Okay," I said. He explained it the way you would explain a filing system. Calm, sequential, no editorializing. The store was not a store. It had the shape of one, the signage and the equipment and the layout, but that was the lure. The organism underneath used the retail structure the way an anglerfish uses the light, to draw in something it needed. What it needed was specific, not just any employee. The hiring process filtered for blood type, but not in a medical sense. The store needed a particular chemical composition, and blood type was the fastest external marker for it. Every person Lincoln had ever onboarded had matched the requirement. I thought about the application. The part where I'd had to list my blood type, I'd thought that was an insurance thing. The laminated rules, Lincoln continued, were not safety procedures. I'd suspected that. What I hadn't known was what they actually were. Each rule, followed in sequence over the course of the night shift, introduced a specific environmental stimulus that interacted with the employee's biology in a targeted way. Gradual, incremental. The store was calibrating me, breaking me down and rebuilding the relevant compounds in a form it could use. For the wide format printer. I looked over at the wide format printer. It sat there the same way it always had, big and beige and utilitarian, with the ink cartridge panel on the front and a roll of glossy paper loaded in the back. "The printing cycle," Lincoln said, "requires organic ink. The store produces it from the employees. The rules are the preparation process." I thought about the photograph I'd found on the drum at the start of the shift. The one of me, older and hollowed out, holding the Employee of the Month plaque. The dark stain across the bottom corner. Not a stain. I didn't say that out loud. "You were not hired to work here," Lincoln said. "You were sourced." He said it the same way he'd said everything else, not as a threat, just as information. The way you'd tell someone their package was ready for pickup. I stood on my side of the counter with the map of my mom's house between us and the folded skin and the junk drawer body of my supervisor, and I thought about the debt from Rutgers and the fact that I'd needed this job, and the fact that I'd taken it, and I didn't say anything for a while. The walls had started to look different. I noticed that. I didn't say that out loud either. The walls had been doing it for a few minutes before I actually registered what I was looking at. It was slow at first. The kind of slow where you keep telling yourself it's the lighting, or you're tired, or you've been staring at the same stretch of drywall for too long and your brain's filling in stuff that isn't there. The color had shifted. That's the only way I can describe it. The off-white had gone somewhere warmer and darker, and not in a good way. More like the inside of something. The texture had changed too. Not visibly, just in the way the surface caught the fluorescent light differently, like it had gone slightly soft. Like pressing your finger into it would leave a mark. I didn't press my finger into it. The rhythm was the part that got me. There was a pulse to it. The walls were moving in and out, barely. Just enough that if you watched one fixed point long enough, you could track it. Slow. Regular. Like breathing. Except walls don't breathe. Except these ones apparently did now. I stood there behind the counter and watched it happen, and felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Lincoln was still on his side of the counter, or what was left of Lincoln. The skin was folded on the floor. The keys and chargers and packing tape that made up whatever he actually was had gone still, which somehow felt worse than when he was moving and talking. At least when he was talking, I had something to focus on. I was trying to figure out what to do next when the front doors opened. The chime went off, the regular two-tone chime, the same one it had made every time someone walked in that night. Completely normal. I almost laughed. The guy who walked in was average height, average build. He was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie, the kind of outfit that makes someone completely invisible in any public space. I couldn't tell you his hair color. I couldn't tell you if he was clean-shaven. His face was... I don't know how to put this exactly. It was there, but it wasn't landing. Every time I tried to look directly at it, my eyes slid off to the side, like trying to read something written in a font that keeps shifting. I'd look, and then I'd be looking at the wall behind him instead, and I'd have to drag my eyes back, and then the same thing would happen again. His name tag was readable, though, clear as anything. White plastic, black text, the same style as mine. It said Zayden Hampton. He walked up to the counter, didn't look around the store, didn't check his phone. He came straight to the counter like he knew exactly where it was and exactly what he wanted, and he put both hands flat on the surface and looked at me. Or pointed his face at me, I guess, since the looking part was hard to confirm. I said, "Can I help you?" Because I genuinely didn't know what else to say. Old habits. He didn't answer. His right hand started moving toward me across the counter. I stepped back. There was maybe 3 feet of counter between us, and I figured that was enough. It was not enough. His arm kept coming. The hand crossed the halfway point and kept going, and the arm behind it just stretched. There's no better word. It stretched the way taffy stretches when you pull it, slow and continuous. The elbow passing over the edge of the counter, and then the shoulder, and then his whole upper body was leaning forward at an angle that a spine doesn't allow. And the hand was still coming, fingers spread, reaching for my shirt collar. I grabbed the ink solvent from my belt. I'd picked it up in the break room earlier in the night. I didn't have a specific reason at the time. It was just a solid, familiar object in a room full of things that were starting to feel wrong, and I'd tucked it into my belt loop the way you pocket something without thinking about it. I was glad I had it. I didn't know yet why it would work. I just knew the store had built this thing the same way it built everything else in here, and the solvent was the most chemically aggressive thing I had access to, and I didn't have a lot of options. I twisted the cap off and poured it over his arm. The reaction was immediate. The skin went first. It split along the forearm like wet paper, and the color drained out of it, cyan and magenta bleeding into each other and running down toward the countertop in 2 separate streams that mixed at the bottom into a bruised purple. The hand dissolved before it reached me. The whole forearm went next, and then the elbow, and what was left of Zayden Hampton pulled back from the counter and made a sound that I'm not going to try to describe because I don't have the vocabulary for it, and I don't want to spend time thinking about it. He stepped back. The puddle on the counter spread slowly toward the edge. He walked back out through the front doors. The chime went off again. I stood there for a second with the empty bottle in my hand. The solvent was gone. That was it. One use. I set the bottle on the counter next to the puddle and I ran. The back of the store was darker than the front. The fluorescents back here were flickering in a way they hadn't been an hour ago, and the walls were doing the same breathing thing as the front, maybe worse. The color was deeper back here, more saturated. I kept moving and didn't look at them directly, the same way I'd learned not to look directly at Zayden Hampton's face. I was heading for the management-only door. I had some idea that it was a way out, or at least a way through to something that wasn't the main floor of a store that was currently trying to digest me. I don't know if it was a good plan. It was the only plan I had. I was about halfway down the main aisle when I looked up. I don't know why I looked up. Maybe the flickering lights made me track upward. Maybe I heard something. But I looked up at the drop ceiling, at the foam tiles and the metal grid, and there was something in it. The tiles in one section had been pushed aside. Not recently. The edges were dark with age, and the grid was warped like it had been that way for a long time. And in the gap, fused into the insulation, there was a skeleton, still dressed. That was the part that stuck with me. A blazer, navy blue with some kind of embroidered patch on the breast pocket. The fabric had gone gray with dust, but the cut was still there. The lapels and the pocket square and the whole thing. The skeleton was sitting up into the insulation at an angle, like it had been pressed upward from below, and the ceiling had closed around it. The bones had gone slightly yellow. The blazer had a small pin on the lapel. I couldn't read it from where I was standing. Lincoln had mentioned during orientation, offhand, like it was just a piece of store trivia, that the location hadn't had a real manager since 1994. He'd said it the way you say a place hasn't had a good cook since the last one retired. Nostalgic, almost. The patch on the blazer pocket was a soccer ball, small and embroidered and faded, but a soccer ball. 1994. The World Cup had been in 94. I remembered that because my dad had watched every game. I stood in the aisle and looked at the skeleton in the ceiling and understood what Lincoln had actually meant when he said the store hadn't had a real manager since then. Not that the position had been vacant. Not that they'd been running it without one. That the last one was still here. Right above me, in the insulation, wearing his blazer. I thought about Edwin in the shredder. I thought about the photograph of me with the hollow eyes and the plaque and the stain across the bottom. I thought about what Lincoln had said, sourced, and what the printing cycle required. And I started moving again because standing still felt like the worst possible thing I could do. The management-only door was at the end of the back corridor. Gray metal, no window, a standard commercial handle. I reached it. I put my hand on the handle. That's when I noticed the floor. Under the flickering fluorescent, my shadow should have been right there, stretched out behind me, slightly distorted, same as it had been all night. I looked down. The floor was empty. Just tile. Just me, standing there, and no shadow attached to my feet at all. I looked up at the wall across from me. The shadow was there. My shadow. Except it wasn't on the floor where it should have been. It was on the wall, vertical, standing upright. And it was wrong in every way a shadow can be wrong. Too tall, too thin. The proportions were off, like someone had grabbed the top of it and pulled. My arms were normal length. Its arms were almost to the floor. I didn't move. It did. It turned its head. Slow. The way you'd turn to check if someone was following you. And then it just stood there, facing the management-only door, and I understood something without having to think about it too hard. It wasn't mine anymore. It had been, probably. At some point during the night, something had been pulling at it, loosening it from me, and I'd been too busy with everything else to notice. Now it was just standing there on the wall like it had somewhere to be. Then it started making noise. Not talking. Not exactly. It was more like clicking. Rhythmic. Evenly spaced. The kind of sound a radiator makes when it's warming up, except faster and more deliberate. Like a pattern. Like it was sending something. The scratching behind the drywall, which had gone quiet for maybe 10 minutes, started up again immediately. And it matched. Click, pause, click, click, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. Back and forth. Whatever was in the walls was listening and responding. And my shadow was the one doing the asking. That part scared me more than the raincoat thing. More than Lincoln peeling himself apart. Because the raincoat thing was external. Lincoln was external. This was mine. This was something that had been attached to me all night. And I hadn't protected it, hadn't even known I needed to. And now it was standing there coordinating with whatever lived inside the walls of a FedEx office in Secaucus at 3 in the morning. The shadow reached for the door handle, not fast, deliberately. Its arm extended down from the wall at an angle that shouldn't have worked geometrically, and the fingers, too long, way too long, spread out toward the handle of the management-only door. And I knew. I don't know how to explain it better than that. I just knew. The same way I knew what the photograph meant when I first saw it. The same way I knew not to touch the shredder after Edwin started talking. I knew that if those fingers closed around that handle and the door opened, whatever was on the other side would come through and that would be it. Not it, like a bad night. It like the skeleton in the ceiling. It like Edwin in the shredder. It like the hollow-eyed version of me in the photograph, except I wouldn't even get that far. I'd go straight into the architecture. I looked around fast. There was a display rack about 4 feet to my left, one of those spinning ones that holds impulse buy stuff near a register. Pens, sticky notes, a few small accessories in plastic packaging, and sitting in a cup at the top, mixed in with ballpoints and a mechanical pencil, was a silver-plated letter opener, the kind with the flat blade and the little decorative ridge along the handle. We sold them. I'd seen them earlier and thought nobody buys letter openers at a FedEx office, which, fair, but right now I was very glad we stocked them. I grabbed it. The shadow's fingers were maybe 6 inches from the handle. I didn't think about it. I crossed the distance in 2 steps and drove the blade into the floor, at the base of the wall, right where the shadow's feet met the tile. The letter opener wasn't heavy. It wasn't a weapon in any real sense. But it went in. Not deep. Just enough to stick. And the second the blade touched the floor at that spot, the shadow made a sound. It shrieked. That's the only word. High and sharp and wrong, like feedback from a microphone, except it came from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor under my feet. The clicking stopped. The scratching stopped. The shadow folded in on itself fast, like paper burning from the edges inward. And then it was just a cloud of black powder drifting down to the tile. Toner. It smelled exactly like the printer cartridges we kept in the supply closet. I stood there with my hand still on the letter opener, which was now just a letter opener stuck in a floor, and I waited. The management-only door stayed shut. The scratching didn't come back. I stayed crouched on the floor for probably 2 full minutes. My knees hurt. The fluorescent above me was still flickering. The toner dust had mostly settled into a rough oval on the tile, and I was kneeling right at the edge of it. And I remember thinking I should probably sweep that up before Lincoln. And then I remembered what Lincoln was, and I stopped thinking about what Lincoln would want. Eventually I stood up. I pulled the letter opener out of the floor. There was a small gouge in the tile, clean and straight. I put the opener in my pocket. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. It had worked once. I looked at the wall where the shadow had been. Just wall. Beige paint, a small scuff mark at about knee height, a fire safety notice in a plastic frame. No shadow. I looked at the floor. My feet were right there under the fluorescent light, and the floor around them was empty. I moved to the left. Nothing. I moved back toward the display rack and looked at the tile under the overhead light, which was the brightest point in the corridor, the exact conditions where a shadow should have been most visible. Nothing. I went and stood in front of the glass panel beside the front doors, the long vertical pane that ran floor to ceiling next to the entrance. I stood right in front of it. I looked at my reflection. I was there. I could see my polo, my jeans, my face, the dark circles, the letter opener-shaped bulge in my pocket. I was there. Then the lights in the store shifted slightly. One of the overheads brightened by a fraction, and I watched my reflection go soft at the edges. And then it was just gone, like it had never been there. The glass showed the store behind me, the display rack, the corridor, the ceiling tiles. No me. I put my hand flat on the glass. I could feel it. Cold, smooth, slightly greasy from the cleaning spray we'd used earlier. I was there. I was touching it. The glass just didn't care anymore. I stepped back. I wasn't going to figure this out standing in front of a window at 3 in the morning. I knew that. I also knew I wasn't leaving. Not because I didn't want to, but because something had shifted in the last 30 seconds in a way I couldn't name yet. A kind of settling, like a door closing in a room you can't see. The store felt different around me. Less like something hunting. More like something that had already caught what it needed and was just waiting for the rest to catch up. I went to the break room. I sat down in the plastic chair by the vending machine. I put the empty ink solvent bottle on the table in front of me and the letter opener next to it, and I just sat there for a while. At some point I fell asleep in the chair. I don't remember deciding to. I just went under. When I woke up, it was still dark outside and my mouth felt wrong, dense, full of something dry and papery. I ran my tongue across the back of my teeth and it didn't move the way a tongue moves. I opened my mouth and pressed my finger in and felt the edges of something flat and tightly packed, like a stack of receipts folded small. I tried to say something, anything, just to hear my own voice. And what came out was nothing. Not a whisper, not a rasp, just air moving through paper. I sat there with my hand over my mouth for a while. The store hummed around me. The vending machine cycled through its refrigeration. Somewhere in the front, the wide format printer made its low idle sound. The one it made all night, whether you were printing or not. I looked at the clock on the break room wall. 5:42. Zachary would be there in 18 minutes. I had 18 minutes, so I used them to get to the front. The break room was behind me and the sales floor was mostly dark. Just the security lighting and the glow from the printer bank on the left wall. I walked slow. My sneakers on the tile made the only sound that felt real. Everything else, the hum from the overhead fixtures, the low idle of the wide format machine, the soft rhythmic pulse coming from somewhere behind the drywall, all of that felt like the store talking to itself. My sneakers on the tile felt like me. I stopped at the counter and looked at the glass doors. Parking lot was empty. The streetlights out on Route 3 were still on. That orange-yellow color they get before dawn. A shopping cart from somewhere was parked at the edge of the lot, crooked, one wheel up on the curb. Nobody had pushed it there on purpose. It had just ended up there. I stood behind the counter and waited. At some point, I looked down at the glass case next to the register and realized I couldn't see myself in it. Not even a faint outline. Nothing. Just the counter surface and the display inside. The one with the custom stamp sets and the USB drives in the little cardboard sleeves. I was standing right there and the glass didn't know it. I looked away. I'd already known that. It just kept being true in new places. 6 o'clock came. I know it was 6, because the clock on the wall behind me clicked over, and I'd been watching it. And then headlights swept across the front windows, and a silver Honda Civic pulled into the lot and parked in the second spot from the door, which is where Zachary always parks. He's got a thing about parking too close to the entrance. Says it's lazy. I know that about him. I know a lot of things about him that don't help me right now. He got out of the car in his jacket, the dark green one with the broken zipper pull he'd been meaning to replace since October, and jeans, and he walked to the front doors and cupped his hands around his eyes and looked in. I was standing maybe 4 feet away. He looked right at me, or right through me. I'm still not sure which one it is, and I don't think it matters anymore. His face did the thing it had been doing every morning, the thing I'd had enough mornings now to recognize. He'd start with this focused, searching look, and then it would soften into something tired, and then he'd press his forehead against the glass for a second, just a second, and then he'd pull back and stand there. He did all of that. I put my hand flat on the glass from my side. He didn't react, not even a flinch. The glass didn't fog from my breath. I don't think I leave warmth anymore, at least not the kind that shows. He stood there for a few more minutes. He said something. I could see his mouth move, but I couldn't hear it through the glass, and I couldn't answer it through anything. I tried anyway. I opened my mouth and pushed air through the paper where my tongue used to be, and it made a sound like a receipt being pulled slowly off a roll. Quiet. Dry. Not a human sound. He pulled out his phone and called someone. Me, probably. My phone was in the break room on the table next to the empty solvent bottle. I heard it buzz twice from back there and then stop. He waited a little longer. Then he walked back to the Civic and got in and sat there for a while with the engine off. I stayed at the counter. At 6:41 he started the car and pulled out of the lot and turned left onto the road, and the taillights got small and then were gone. I went to the break room and found the crackers. They were the Keebler Club kind, the ones in the red sleeve, and they'd expired in March. Not this March, the March before. They tasted like cardboard with a memory of salt, which was fine. I ate them standing up next to the vending machine and looked at the options inside the machine like I was going to choose something different today. I wasn't. It was always the Jack Link's teriyaki jerky, the one in the yellow bag, because it was the only thing in there with enough actual substance to feel like food. I fed the machine 2 quarters and a dime, and it dropped the bag, and I ate half of it and put the rest in my back pocket for later. That was the morning routine. That was all of it. The nights had their own thing. Sometime after midnight, usually around 1, sometimes closer to 2, the walls would start. It wasn't loud. That was the part that got to me more than anything, that it wasn't loud. It was just this low, steady murmur, like someone in the next room reading a list. My name was in there. I couldn't always make out the other words, but my name was always in there. And after the first few nights, I'd figured out that if I let myself listen to it long enough, something in me started to loosen, like a knot going slack. I didn't know exactly what would happen after that, and I didn't want to find out. So I ran the laminator. The store had a GBC heat seal H212 sitting on the self-service table, a big commercial unit, and it ran hot and loud, and the motor had a high-pitched whine that you could feel in your back teeth. I'd taken 3 pages from the laminated rules sheet, the ones Lincoln had given me on the first night, already laminated, and I fed them through one at a time and then fed them through again, over and over. The machine couldn't actually add more lamination to something already laminated. It just ran the pages through and heated them, and the motor screamed and the rollers grabbed, and I stood there and fed them through again. It was a stupid thing. I knew it was a stupid thing. But the whine cut right through whatever the walls were saying, and I could stand there and just be a person running a machine, which was technically what I'd been hired to do. The pages came out warm each time, slightly more yellow at the edges from the repeated heat. The first rule was still legible. Do not acknowledge any customer who enters during precipitation. I'd broken that one. The second rule under it was starting to blur. I did that until the walls went quiet, which was usually around 4. Then I turned the laminator off and stood in the silence for a while, and then I went to the chair and sat down. Tonight I reached into my pocket and took out the photograph. I'd been not looking at it for days. I knew it was there. I just kept not taking it out. But it was 4 in the morning and the store was quiet, and I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and I figured I might as well. It was still glossy, still crisp. The image was still me, older, hollower, the uniform more worn, holding the Employee of the Month plaque with both hands. The date on the plaque was still 5 years out. The dark crimson stain was still spreading across the bottom corner, the way a spill spreads when nobody stops it. I looked at it for a long time. The first night I'd found it, I thought it was a warning. Something the store had planted to scare me off or bait me forward, some kind of threat dressed up as a prediction. Then for a while I thought maybe it was a mistake, something left over from a different version of events that hadn't happened yet and didn't have to. I didn't think either of those things now. It was a photograph of where I was going to end up. That was all. Not a threat, not a message. Just a picture of the road I was already on, taken from the far end. The store hadn't planted it to warn me away. It had planted it because it already knew I wasn't going to leave, and it wanted me to know that it knew. and it had been patient enough to wait while I figured it out myself. I put the photograph back in my pocket. The empty solvent bottle was on the counter where I'd left it. I looked at it. That bottle had been the right call at the right second, and it had bought me exactly enough time to drive a letter opener into the floor and keep the door closed and anchor myself here for good. I didn't regret it. I'd thought about whether I regretted it, and I didn't, which was either a sign that I'd made the right choice or a sign that the store had already gotten further into me than I realized. I wasn't sure it mattered which one. Outside, the parking lot was empty. The shopping cart was still there, wheel on the curb. In 18 hours, Zachary would be back. He'd cup his hands around his eyes and look in, and I'd be 4 feet away, and he wouldn't see me, and I'd put my hand on the glass anyway. I'd do that every morning for as long as he kept coming. Maybe that was the only thing left that was still mine. The showing up, the hand on the glass. The being there, even when being there, didn't count for anything. The wide format printer idled in the dark. The walls were quiet. I put the photograph back in my pocket and sat with the hum of the store around me and waited for morning.